Hey everyone, this is Parthi from Letterdrop. On this podcast, we learn practical tips from B2B growth and marketing practitioners that you can start applying today. Go to market is changing with AI and this very unforgiving capital environment. The playbooks from the past decade aren't going to work quite as well anymore. We believe the future of revenue is inbound, and we're here to help navigate this new go to market motion. Today on the show, we have Nimo Shkedy. He is a fellow YC alum and recently exited his company, Apollo Shield. And I'm very excited to have him here because he's helped a lot of companies figure out how to repeat the process that he's learned previously in terms of go to market. And he's helped companies like small startups up to like very large companies, which have seen massive revenue milestones. And I'll let you name them if you want, Nimo, in the past little bit. So with that, Nimo, I'll let you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why the audience should listen to you.
All right. Thank you, Parthi. So I'm formerly literally a computer hacker from Unit 8200, which is the Israeli NSA. And later I became a startup founder. I raised about $3 million from Y Combinator and other investors. And I drove my previous startup to profitability and revenues of approximately $2 million. Today, after handing over the leadership to my co-founder, I specialize in getting startups from early sales to repeatable sales. And I typically use clever automation and guerrilla tactics to get the first leads. But even after that, there's a full process that the startup needs to go through from the point where, even if they have enough leads, to the point where they have predictable or at least repeatable sales. That's basically my background.
Amazing. I did not know that you were literally a computer hacker. That's a fun fact. Awesome. So, Nimo, tell me a little bit more. You've worked with about a dozen early stage companies in the past year. At what stage in their life cycle did you start helping them, and how did you help them with their go-to-market motion?
Right. So, like I said, most of the startups that I work with, I have like two kinds of startups. The first one is unicorns, but you will see that because of the way that I work, I typically don't name them. And also, I work with early stage startups that have early sales of, maybe they have 5 or 10 B2B customers. And what I help them do primarily is identify which of these customers are, usually when startups have like 5 to 10 first customers, they're either spread out into very different groups, and sometimes they're clustered into a few clusters of similar clients. Now, this is where I usually start, but where we have to end in order for for early stage companies to be able to raise subsequent funding is we have to end at a point where enough of their customers are of like the same shape and size, I would call it, and where the startup is solving the same problem for them, that it actually makes for a credible start to raise additional funding and be able to predict pretty well that they can indeed like get from X customers to 3X or 10X customers. And you can really only do that when you have a repeatable process and you're selling to similar kind of personas at similar companies solving similar problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about repeatable revenue. I think there's this guy I follow on LinkedIn, and I'm blanking on his name, but one thing he mentioned is you can technically get a business, like typically viewed as a startup, a business to $1 million in ARR and not have product market fit. And that's very possible just by kind of like brute forcing it. And then what happens is you essentially have a lot of customers along a lot of different segments. They don't look like each other. And so you've been able to get sales, but you don't necessarily have repeatable sales of the same sort of problem you're solving for a customer who looks the same consistently. And so I think that's a really great point that you bring up over there. In terms of you actually helping these companies out, what is something you've helped them uh, do in terms of like a maybe a cool growth experiment that you've run? Like, what's your favorite growth experiment that you've run for one of these companies?
Yeah, so I specialize in all kinds of outbound tactics, but really this is just a way to get enough meetings. But usually startups struggle even with choosing what kind of customers they should be reaching out to. Because if you have like five different types of customers, how are you going to choose which one is which one is your favorite? So I actually have a framework for this, and this framework kind of involves putting all of these different suspects in a table and scoring them according to like how likely the problem is to repeat, how strong of a problem that was for the person you're solving it for, and how often will your solution become applicable for them. So this is kind of a rough start, and a lot of the times, just to get started, you're in a position where you want to try to reach out to all of them, but you can't really do that because unless you specialize in one particular problem and you're able to solve it particularly well, you're not going to be particularly appealing for any one of them. So the challenge is, how do you like prioritize them, and how do you go through them fast enough to understand what's going to be, what you're going to be able to repeat and what you should just drop and move on to the next type of customer because you just got lucky once. Now I can go over to the next phase and discuss how we can identify the right customers. Like once you've identified a specific segment that you might want to go after, you're just prioritizing that as like maybe your number one priority. Your goal would be to get either a validation or a disproof of your assumptions that you're going to be able to serve this particular customer segment well, and you want to get that fast. And so for that, I actually have the 5 out of 50 rule. And the way that I do this is I help the companies that I work with understand where to find the 50 most probable customers. So you really have to dig deep on that and understand, maybe your solution works for companies who are of this size and of that type, and who specifically have, this person or this type of engineer on the team, but also doesn't have another type of engineer on the team because a person in that position is probably going to want to do what you do on their own. Okay, so you have to mix a lot of different signals which you can get from a lot of different sources and make kind of, in an automated way, make a list of your top customers. So let's talk about how you're going to understand whether you're reaching out to the right segment or you should drop it. So the first thing you want to do is identify as many different characteristics as you can about your customer that makes it like the absolutely dream customers, the one that has to be like really in a really where their problem is the worst and you're able to solve it in the best way. So typically this would involve things like team composition, where they might be a team of ex DevOps engineers without a DevOps, without a FinOps engineer. Okay, so this is one example. Other examples are going to be, for example, and there's a way to do this using Apollo and using other tools that you can combine. And you can also, once you have a list of that, you can narrow it down by things like that, by things on the company's website, like to understand whether this company does, solves a particular type of problem where your solution is the best fit. And the idea is that you're going to want to start with a personal outreach to the best customers and get at least 5 out of 50 of them to say yes to a meeting. If you can't do that, then either you've selected the wrong type of customers, or you have the wrong message and it's not resonating with your customers. So if you don't have that, go back to square one. Now, step two, if you are able to do that, is you're going to want to automate this. And I recommend tools like Clay and Apollo and a handful of other tools to conduct the best possible research for customers. And again, go through a similar process until you reach about a 1% conversion rate from email to interested customers, because that's going to give you the hint that your message does resonate with the customers that you're after. So you can do that even before you've started to develop your product.
Absolutely. And I think these are some rules that maybe like companies which are further along as well, like early marketing sales teams need to think about as well in terms of figuring out, okay, who are we actually selling to? Who is the right fit customer as they want to scale these kinds of operations out? On our side, for example, we use Clay, we use Apollo, use all those platforms. Turns out channel matters actually. Because when I wake up in the morning, I have 100 unread emails and they all go to trash. So it kind of doesn't matter how good your email is. I will still move it to trash in many ways if I don't recognize who it's from. And so what works for us really is like we also dog food our own product quite a bit is we drive a lot of inbound from LinkedIn. And then the other two things that work really well for us are cold calling and then also very personalized LinkedIn messages. And when I say personalized LinkedIn messages, I mean like we'll do videos. I'll just like literally go on a walk and record myself and talk to people as well. None of the scales, to be clear, but the net output for us right now doing these things which don't scale beats the kind of like AI scale systems that we were using. And so we're like, you know what, this is driving business for us. And maybe it's the buyer we're selling to as well. We're selling to marketers. So they're like very savvy about being sold to. So they value a lot of authentic stuff. But I think it's interesting. I think the part that I really liked about what you said was identifying the right person to go after repeatedly. Because if you go after like too broad of an audience, it's going to be very hard for your message to land. I totally agree with that.
And I think that also, if you're doing the personal messages, my thoughts are that first of all, 99% of the time, I believe personally that if you have a relevant message, it doesn't necessarily have to be personalized. I can't tell you how many times I have opened an email or I have clicked on an ad or I did respond to a LinkedIn post because it like deeply resonated with the problem that I had. So if you're able to do that, I think that you'll also be able to find customers in any one of the ways that you mentioned.
Yeah. And when I say personalization, I don't mean like, hey, like you went to the same college as me, like go sports team or anything along those lines. When I say personalization, I mean like very good observations about their business, about their role, instead of like blanket statements, essentially. So for example, I reached out to a CMO and booked a demo with the CMO recently. I saw she was on a podcast. I listened to 2 minutes of the podcast. She complained about something. She claimed she was doing something. I looked at her sales team. I was like, these people are not connecting with anybody on LinkedIn. Clearly, like their feeds are empty. Is this actually working for you? I sent her a message about a problem that she claimed that she had solved, but it was clear that she had not solved. And that resonated with her. So that's what I mean by personalization over here. More so like, to your point, figuring out what is the trigger. Do I really understand your business? Do I really understand like what the problem you're talking about, and not like the fluffy type of personalization? In terms of how do you determine whether or not something is working or not? Like how do you decide like when you need to pivot away from a certain type of outreach or channel, because there are things which take time. So for example, I would say that if every company like you have a good LinkedIn presence, build trust and credibility with your target buyer, and essentially A, help you build more inbound, and then B, make it easier for your outbound to convert, essentially, just because people are maybe like warmed up. They're like, oh yeah, like these are ideas, I've heard of that before, etc. But it doesn't happen immediately. This is like you simply cannot test LinkedIn over the period of a month. It's like 6 months of at least like several months of showing up every day consistently, talking about a problem, and then building the right community of people who care about solving these types of problems. Um, and I know that's very different from the pure outbound approach, but how do you think about these kinds of plays which take longer to prove out?
Yeah. So actually, I do agree that developing content in parallel with LinkedIn outreach is probably a very, very good and strong approach. I've tried it myself. It works very well if if you are really investing it, uh, because the more people that you reach out to, and with personalizations like you mentioned, anytime you continue to post new stuff for them to see, and being helpful is going to be very much easier for you to continue the discussion with them, whether they responded positive to you or not in the first time. Now, about your question, how do you decide what works and what doesn't? So there are actually four stages that you have to go through, and the first stage that you would like to go through is just having enough discussions with people. These can be via DM, or even in comments on LinkedIn, or via email messages. And if you're not so the first thing that doesn't, like, if it doesn't work, is just not having enough discussions. So think about your approach. If you're messaging if you're messaging 50 to 100 people and you're not getting at least 5 discussions going, you're headed in the wrong direction. The same thing in the I would say, usually, if you're not at least 1 out of 10, and in the early stages, if you can't get at least 1 out of 10 people you reach out to have a discussion with you, or if you can't get 1 out of 10 people who have a discussion with you to book a meeting with you, or if you can't get 1 out of 10 people who book a meeting with you to start a trial for your product, then something's wrong and you have to change your approach.
Gotcha. Yeah, those are definitely interesting numbers. It's interesting, and it's hard to reconcile with these, because I know I've definitely been in situations where those things didn't work. We did change things, but it was like much more fluid almost. It wasn't almost intentional. It was kind of like, okay, let's try this messaging, or let's try reaching out to people this way. And I think what you're trying to help companies do or think about is, how do I stop doing this by chance, or how do I stop doing this by accident, and how do I do this in a very intentional way, if I'm reading this right?
Yeah, exactly. You're right. And I didn't mean that you have to change, go back to square one. Sometimes all you have to change is change your approach by, 30 degrees to the right, or change part of the messaging. And you just really have to experiment. But I do like to to kind of have red flags, where you're saying, if this is not reaching at least, this amount of interest to go to the next stage, then we need to change something. I don't know what, but we definitely have to change something.
Absolutely. In terms of we've talked about this outbound messaging stuff, and you've helped companies at different stages, right? So you've helped like early stage companies, you've helped later stage companies as well. With the later stage companies, like, what are the ways in which you help them that's different from the early stage companies?
Yeah, so I find that with later stage companies, some of the things that don't work as well are the SDRs find it very, very hard to keep up with the pace of innovation and noise that's going on around them. So that's where ultra personalization really, really helps. Like you said, the idea that you mentioned before about reaching out to a person from a podcast about a particular problem that they faced, this is something that I've been able to automate for companies in a really, really good way. And you can do that from a bunch of sources. You can do that from podcasts. You can actually do that even from people's LinkedIn profiles, or you can do a combination. For example, I've worked with a company that sells to M&A professionals, and typically these people have web pages where they expose a lot of information about themselves. So you can use AI. Once you've generated a pretty random list of this type of people, you can crawl the internet, look up their pages, and find the particular industry that they specialize in. And you can actually do that for a handful of, for a lot of other different use cases. But if you're able to do that and you combine it with something specific that your platform or that your product can do in the specific industry that these people operate in, then you have a very strong value proposition.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think people, it's all about the quality of the inputs and tying that appropriately to an email. I think there was a LinkedIn post yesterday. I think it was an SDR from Ramp reached out to somebody, and it was a researched email. It was pulling out data from various places, from their LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff. But the problem was it pulled out bad data, essentially. It was running an automated process, but he probably had 4 LinkedIn jobs. And I think it picked the wrong LinkedIn job, active job, essentially, and said, you have experience in these industries. And he's like, I don't. And so I think the intent behind that was good, in the sense that they were trying to figure out, okay, how do we scalably automate research? And then there are all of these small things that went wrong, which led to a bad email. But regardless of this, I think what we're pointing out is, in order to do good outbound, companies need to really figure out, okay, how do we collect good intent data, or how do we actually understand how people are thinking about this stuff? One of the ways we've been thinking about it is, sometimes it's hard to find triggers online. People, there's, for certain types of products, you cannot find anything on their website, like internal tools or things along those lines, right? Maybe your buyer is not active online, or they're not really active on LinkedIn, or they're on Twitter or anything along those lines. So you don't have a lot of stuff to work with at that point in time. And so in those cases, one of the things that we've discovered works really well is putting content out there, because content is basically a fake trigger. It's like helping you create triggers, because if you can observe who is engaging with the content, who is reading these blog posts, who is liking, commenting on these LinkedIn posts, and you need to put stuff out there in order to gather that data, suddenly you have a talking point. You can be like, oh, you like this, or you read this, so you must be interested in this topic. We can solve that problem for you. So that's another way, again, at scale, I think maybe companies can think about creating their own intent data if it doesn't exist out there already.
Yes, I agree with that. It's a great point that you make. This actually reminds me of two things that worked really, really well for some of my clients. They work at a small scale. They probably won't work as well as you scale much, much bigger. But one of the problems that you mentioned is, what if your prospects aren't online? What if they aren't active? And actually, for that, I have a very cool hack to find the first 50 people that you should contact, or even more than that. What you can do is find other posts or find other companies that are kind of in like an adjacent space to yours, and use a bunch of tools like Phantom Buster and NA10 to compose a list of anybody who's ever reacted to any post by these handful of companies, say in the past 1 to 3 months. That's when you know that these people are active and are on LinkedIn. And if you reach out to them, there's a much, much higher likelihood that you'll get a response. So it's great if you produce content, but content production, and until these people find you, it's going to take, say, 3 to 6 months if you make good content. Whereas if you're already leveraging other people's content or other companies' content, you can get there faster.
Yeah, absolutely. You can definitely do that with LinkedIn. Little bit more challenging to do that with website data. I think that's proprietary. Only the company themselves has like their own Clearbit or Sixth Sense or anything to see who's coming in. But yes, LinkedIn it's kind of democratic. Like you can see who's liking, commenting on anybody's posts. You should obviously go through your own stuff, but I agree with that. At Letterdrop, we have a hack which we like to do, which is if we see somebody who's talking about a topic that we're interested in, we'll comment on it, and then we'll get our entire team to essentially comment or engage with that. So it becomes the top comment. and so that we can steal visibility essentially from somebody else who already has an audience in our space. So that's also something that works really well.
Yeah, that's a great hack. That's a great hack.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of our tooling also, like we help companies think through this kind of stuff. How do you automate those kinds of things? Like you mentioned, getting that influence data. Like how do you like boost your content or comments visibility, all that kind of stuff. In terms of like going back to marketing teams, especially at scale marketing teams, one of the things I observe is like a lot of companies want to do almost like vanilla tactics. They just want to run like pretty standard playbooks. They want to just like take the default settings in Apollo, drop in a list, put in the sequence, and go send off a whole bunch of emails. And maybe if the company has a large enough brand, some of this stuff works. But how would you encourage? I think about this in terms of like in engineering, you have the concept of 10x engineers, right? What is the equivalent of how does somebody become like a 10x growth or marketing person in your mind? And I'm not thinking about this in terms of just like early stage companies. I'm thinking just like a person who's able to walk into any sort of organization and figure out, okay, I'm going to do the things that nobody else is doing, or figure out how to approach this really intelligently. How would you get people to think about that or get themselves in that mindset?
So I think that besides the hacks, which you mentioned, the LinkedIn comment with like lots of engagements on the comment is
Sure.
getting you a lot of visibility, and also the combination of outreach and content. These are actually really, really good hacks. But I think that the underlying thing about any kind of marketing, whether it's outbound or inbound, is to very, very deeply understand your prospect. This is something that I find really rare in a lot of cases. And I'll give you an example of like a perfect understanding, not from outbound perspective, but from like a paid ad. There's a really good ad that Monday made a few years back, and they were making a tool for file sharing, and they wanted to get into the graphic designer market, into the graphic designer niche. So of course they could have, published an ad where the ad would say, keep all your files in one place, blah blah blah. It's kind of boring and vanilla. But what they did is they really they understood their customers so well that their ad basically said no more files named project x final 5 .psd. So if you're able to get to this level of understanding of your customer, then your message is going to be so strong that it's going to be unignorable. And that's it's not a hack, but it's the underlying thing which I emphasize for any kind of marketing. It's going to work equally well in an email, that if you understand the problem so well that you phrase it in a way that's unignorable, it's going to make all the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like at the end of the day, people just need to like good marketing comes down to basics and just understanding your customer really well. I think a lot of people are excited about AI, and the reality is when people apply AI poorly without good understanding, you just get kind of like meh messaging, meh emails, meh content, which all sounds the same. Your whole goal is to stand out, tell people like we are different, we are a unique solution to solve this problem and we're going to solve it better than anybody else, or like in a different way than anybody else. And I think all that's going to come back to just like truly deeply understanding your customers. And maybe you can use software to collect that data for you. But at some point, it goes back to the customer. It's not about, there are no hacks in terms of understanding customers at the end of the day. Amazing. I and my last question would be more so in terms of when do you think a company has repeatable growth? Do you have like numbers you can share where you're like, this company is failing, this company is stalled, this company has repeatable growth? Because the division between these sometimes is not very clear. It's a continuum almost. Companies oftentimes don't even know themselves when they're where they are. Do you have numbers where you can very clearly say, like, yes, this company is, I would say that they have repeatable growth for now, because they can lose it in the future as well?
Yeah, these things are never stable. You can never rest on your laurels. But basically, I think that there are two questions that you have to ask yourself, like really answer honestly, in order to get to a place where you have repeatable revenue, to a place where you have repeatable sales. The first one is, have you identified the problem well enough that just by asking your prospect two or three questions, you're going to be, you're going to reach 80% confidence of whether this prospect really needs and wants your solution or not. If you don't have two or three questions that give you this 80% confidence, then I don't think you're likely not in the right area code, I would say. The second thing is, are you able to deploy, a single, you really have to master at least one channel that delivers a consistent stream of people that match the criteria of these, three questions to a good confidence for a purchase. And good confidence doesn't have to mean that you're making the sale 100% of the time. It can be, that you make the sale 30% of the time, or even, 10% of the time. But this is really going to give you a process where you know how the input translates to the output.
Amazing. Yeah, no, that I like that. And what I like about your answer is you're talking about leading indicators, not lagging indicators. A lagging indicator here would be like revenue, essentially. Like obviously, like you're growing fast if like revenue is growing at a certain rate. But these are more so like leading indicators, or these are things which identify whether or not you're on track to be able to actually close one revenue down the road. Amazing. Nimo, this was a really great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time. If anybody in our audience wants to reach out to you and perhaps work with you, or just like learn a little bit more about how you think about things in terms of growth, where's the best place to find you online, or how can they contact you?
So you can find me. I'm Nimo Shkedy on LinkedIn or on my website, impact11.com. I happily share all of my thoughts and a lot of my tactics on LinkedIn. So very happy to chat about them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nimo, for joining us today, and really love having you on the podcast.